Vedoucí ateliéru architektury 2, který má podtitul Future Architecture's Platform, je architektka, kurátorka a pedagožka Eva Franch i Gilabert. Kudy vedla její cesta na pražskou UMPRUM a jak vnímá zdejší strukturu a atmosféru?
Since the first moment in which, one enters UMPRUM, one finds a very different atmosphere that one finds in many schools around the world. And I think it has to do also with the different disciplines that inhabit this building and the scale. So there is something about that as an architect is important. Buildings also teach you. And so both of the homes, or the three homes if you want, that UMPRUM has here in Jan Palach, but also when we actually look into Mikulanska or even Kafkarna, these are three very different settings that have very incredible qualities in their own, and they are very unlike any other educational building. And so that to me is already special, because spaces also teach. And so, of course, then there is the entire structure of the studios and how the studios are organized. And in our case, the Future Architecture's Platform is organized in this transversal, transgenerational space that for me is so unique to this context. I've never taught like this before. I've never encountered myself within an educational infrastructure that would have students from the first year, second year, third year, fourth year, fifth year, masters and PhDs, all working together. And so when you are putting your knowledge on the table, you also are in a certain way putting it into different minds, in different moments in their process of learning. And I think that that's fascinating, because you have older students teaching younger students, but also younger students teaching older students on all kind of different perspectives, ways, technologies of approaching and thinking about the questions that I put on the table. So it's a rather fascinating experience, because you can not come with a preconceived idea of what is that you want to teach. You need to be able to adapt. You need to be able to somehow follow and look to each one of the students one-on-one, so that then you also understand what everyone contributes to the whole. So it's a rather special experience. I was in the US, actually. I was teaching at Princeton and at Cooper Union, and I was, in fact, going to take a sabbatical, something that I needed for quite some time. And yet I received an email in my inbox with a beautiful letter, actually, a letter by the students here at UMPRUM, that they were asking if I was willing to consider to come and join them in their educational journey, and that they were obviously aware that there was going to be a change in the leadership of the A2 studio, and that they would love for me to help them into this next phase. The letter was really well written, and it was very much aware of who I was and what I do, and also I think it was very clear what they were looking for in some capacity. And so the first thing I did was to actually ask for a meeting. So we all met in a Zoom, and it was beautiful, because two groups of people, in a certain way, we met, and there were all these little heads, with their hoodies, different ages, faces you have never seen, from a place that, I had come here to give a lecture back in 2018 for a project that I was doing, Letters to the Mayor, and I was lucky enough to come to UMPRUM, and I was already fascinated then about this place, but I didn't know the students necessarily. And so what was fascinating was that in that conversation, we already started to connect. And so I said I would consider it. And the day after, I did send an email to the director of the school, to Jindrich, and to Imbro, actually. And I said if this was an open call, and if this was actually something that was really being considered. And they said, would you consider it? And I said, well, why not? I'm trying to change. I wanted to somehow learn different things. And so, of course, I knew very well the American academic context, and also, in a certain way, in the UK, and also the one that I experienced as a student in Spain and in Catalonia. But I was fascinated by the way in which UMPRUM understands the process of educating an architect. So I came, I made my presentation, and then I got the bid for the position. And that was last year. It's almost a year and some more. And so now I'm going to be here at least for the next 3 more years. And I think it is a very exciting time for me and also for the school as we try to build at least a new phase, no, for our studio, but also for the conversations that we can generate as a school. The project Letters to the Mayor traveled to more than 20 cities around the world. And so it is true that through that project, I met most of the mayors of the different cities and many of the architects that are leaders in producing a form of resistance or a form of leadership in the production and development of those cities. And strangely enough, you could say that many of the same issues are affecting cities nowadays. No, it has to do always with the presence of the car and what do we do with public space, with affordable housing and the kind of financial and architectural models and legal models that we actually have associated with the city. And so it was very interesting for me through this project to have a transversal understanding of what is that constitutes the big problems in contemporary cities globally. Coming here to Prague at that moment, I think it was, for me, a very enriching experience. I had never been before. It was one of my cities, obviously, to visit and cultures to explore and to research. And so this is also for me an opportunity to get a deeper understanding of what is that not only what the Czech architecture has been, but where it is going. So now with the students, we are looking into the last 100 years of architecture production here in the Czech Republic, understanding, analyzing different architectural offices, also looking into contemporary forms of practice. And we are trying to identify the ways in which each one of the students, individually but also collectively, can think how to insert themselves, no, into the future of the architectural profession within the Czech context. And so this is for me a way to transfer some of the knowledge that I developed through my research in the US and in Europe, but at the same time to learn and to produce new forms of knowledge. So we are collaborating with the National Gallery and their pavilion at this year's Venice Architecture Biennale, where we are going to be in residence in November as one of the invited participants to that process.
Studentstvo Architektury 2 ale nečeká jenom spolupráce na Benátském bienále, ale hlavně taky vstup do vlastní praxe po škole, která může obsahovat široké spektrum nejen architektonické práce a uvažování.
There has been a lot of research done that more than 50% of the people who actually do study architecture do not end up practicing as architects. And many of the buildings that we see built are not necessarily nor produced nor designed by architects either. So we have a real tension and I think a kind of a lack of understanding of what are the capacities that we have as architects to build society and how the cities and the territories and the cities are built. And so what we are trying to do in this studio is to teach people to be entrepreneurs, to understand how they want to contribute to the built environment, perhaps by not building, perhaps by changing the legal landscape or producing financial models or by actually producing cultural models that are able to rethink the ways in which we understand architecture as just simply creating an entire new building from the ground up with materials that we are extracting. We are now obviously having new values on the table, from ideas of reuse, circularity and sustainability, from questions of accessibility and democratization of access to housing, to culture and everything else. And all those big ideals can only be enacted if you have a much transversal understanding of what it means to act and to build. So what I'm always doing as a teacher is to try to identify what is the talent that a student has, what are the capacities that someone has to understand the world and to contribute, and then identify the architect that they are, not actually impose on them an ideal of an architect that in a certain way the single heroic figure that we have imagined an architect to be is disappearing. And we know that actually carries a lot of problematic ideas and relationships in relationship to themselves, to society, and to everyone else. So it's a very interesting exercise to try to rethink architecture education from the point of view that we know that architects are incredible at relating information, at producing synthetic ideas, and about making propositions about new projects, new ways of approaching from politics to architectures of the digital environment to cultural institutions. And so how can we offer a much more targeted education that allows people to start developing these ideas early on while they are still within the school, and not only later on when they realize that becoming an architect in the traditional sense of becoming a draftsman or actually participating in the construction of a building that is a fascinating endeavor. I mean, I'm an architect and I love that part, might not necessarily be what they actually wanted or are interested in doing. And so I'm very interested in opening up and helping each student find how they want to be an architect and what type of architect they want to be. Challenges when you leave the school are many, and they are very different depending on where you studied, in what country or in what context or in what school. So if you actually mostly study in the US, you might end up with financial loans that you will have to pay off. Therefore, you have to earn money. Therefore, you go to a big corporate office so that you actually can earn some money to pay your loans, and then obviously to also get your license, to get accredited. And so despite the fact if in the school you have been taught many things about how the future might look like, you end up actually learning from those ones who come from the past, no? So that there is that version of what it looks like when you leave a school. Then, of course, there is the other version in which you are coming from a very privileged background, in which you don't have to go and pay off your debt by working for someone or actually spending hours executing projects that someone else has designed, in which you can do competitions, in which you can start dealing more with the cultural sector and wait until, you have the right opportunities to present your ideas into a much larger public. And this is a reality. If you come from privilege, you are going to have more opportunities to get that happen. And so for me, what is very important is to actually produce opportunities for absolutely everyone, and also to understand how one can be an entrepreneur and how one can find opportunities. So I always told my students that the most important place to go is where you actually don't have any burdens in financial spaces. I believe in public education, and I think it's extremely important. But second is also to understand that you can and you should create your own opportunities. And you need to be able to learn from everyone, but you also need to identify spaces and opportunities for innovation. It is one of the most difficult things to tell, let's say, a 23-year-old, is to say that they are at the prime time of creativity and innovation, and that they should follow their instincts, and that they should trust themselves, and that in fact they have so much more energy and ideas about how the world could be, that in a certain way the world as we have it, when you are young, most of the times you enter into a chain in which you are the last one in the decision-making process. And so I think it's very important to innovate, to disrupt, and to change the way in which we have done things, because we have plenty of examples that we have not done things in a way that are sustainable for the planet, that are equitable for society, that are just and fair. We come from a series of years in the Western societies and also in other countries where a kind of drive towards forms of capitalism and extreme forms of neoliberalism have produced higher forms of inequality, have produced higher forms of discrimination, and have made the planet less sustainable. And so we need to think how to work about that. So for me right now, my advice to students is find colleagues, find partners, collaborate, associate, don't go solo. Don't think that, in fact, you want to be this single heroic figure. There is power in being together. There is power in actually supporting each other, in actually finding the space in which you can create opportunities. You might still have to work for an office, but find some people in which you can share ideas, in which you can read books, in which you can somehow develop new ideas. And I think that weaving those networks, weaving those collectives, empowering oneself, finding collectives outside of your discipline that are also fighting and working towards the similar goals, I think it is essential. To be involved in all of these different ranges of opportunities is what I think it's to be a citizen. And what I hope for any student that finishes their studies is to understand that responsibility that they have as citizens, and as citizens that they have to contribute to society.
Otevřená platforma pro vzdělávání přináší nové poznatky pro všechny zúčastněné, ať už v rámci studia a výzkumu, anebo otvírání debaty se širokou veřejností.
There is always a strange power dynamic when you're in a studio, because you come with your ideas, but the students may have very different ones. And so for me, what is obviously interesting is to have people who come from very different cultural backgrounds, religious backgrounds, socioeconomic approaches towards society. And the idea is to understand how do we arrive to a space of not necessarily consensus, but understanding of those differences. And so it is true that I am interested in producing a society that is more equal, that is more free. And I will probably have difficulties enabling a student that they would want to make a society that is less equal, that is less free. But it is true that I think it's essential to have those conversations and those debates, and we try to open them up. And we have a very open space for that kind of discussion and debate. What I love is that the students, they come with very different approaches to the old problems, in which those dichotomies, that I might find as already kind of solidified and sometimes impossible to move through, they find other ways to look into the problem. And I think that to me is what is interesting, because there is a kind of intuition that we cannot continue to dismantle or to construct the future through the old tools that we had, ideologically speaking or conceptually speaking. And so I try to produce, and we try to produce, a very open space and a very, communicative platform for all of us to communicate and to express. But I think one also needs to be conscious that as a professor, one also has an authority, and that the students might find it, difficult to express themselves. But what I try to do is that they actually have the capacity to do that through the sessions, through the workshops, but also through some of the excursions that we do. Sometimes we go and we just plant a tent in Cafarna and we spend a weekend watching movies and making fires, in which ideas can open up differently. And, last week also one of the students came here and said, what did you mean about that? And we can have a conversation about things that for them might be more difficult to understand or to share, or in a certain way to comprehend within their framework. And so then we have a conversation about it. And I think it's part of the teaching. Yeah. Right now I'm working with the city of Barcelona for the second consecutive year, developing a festival. And festivals are spaces in which people come together to celebrate, to observe, to explore, and to learn about conversations that are important within the field, but also conversations that are important in the understanding of our shared understanding of the city. And so one of the most difficult things for any one of us is to understand what is driving the change within our cities and who is deciding on those. Of course, we elect politicians and representatives to push certain agendas that we might be in agreement or that sometimes we might not even fully understand. But so what I think is for me essential is for all of us to be informed enough and empowered enough to ensure that the visions that politicians have also have a vision for the city and a vision for the way in which we all want to live together. So this festival that is called Model Architectural Festival in Barcelona is an experiment for us, mostly because in 2026 Barcelona is going to be the world capital of architecture, and we don't know what being a world capital is. This year Copenhagen is for the first time the world capital, but Barcelona is the first one that actually has had the time to plan it. So we are trying to produce these forums and these spaces of debate in which we produce experiments in public space that make us think and reflect about what is that architecture needs to do, what is that architecture could do, and what is that we as citizens we would like that space to do. And so we have, in this case, 5 installations. To give you an example, one of them is asking about the breastfeeding spaces that we have in the city and nursing in public space. Historically has always been seen as something that women do in private space, or that women had to be covered, that there was legally not even allowed for a woman to be in public space. So while we have benches in the street in which someone can sit, sometimes we also have public toilets, we have fountains, we have pieces of infrastructure that allow us to exist in public space in different ways. We do know that for women to actually share their struggle or their capacity to breastfeed or not is something that most of the times is solved by just simply talking with people who actually have gone through it. We don't have those spaces of socialization. nor in public nor in private. They are usually medicalized or they're actually made specialized. So why don't we have in public spaces for that? So one of the installations is actually promoting and inviting men, women, and collectives to actually participate in the design of the future spaces of lactancy. No? And so that to me is a very interesting proposition, because it is about a new typology that tries to actually change the way in which we exist legally, but also emotionally and physically and collectively in public space. Another one of those installations is looking into the way in which we think about rooftops and the architectural materials that surround our buildings. That right now we always think about a wall having to enclose, no, for temperature reasons, for sound reasons, for property reasons. But of course now we know that one of the big problems that the planet has is the lack of pollinators. So pollinators from bees to many other insects are being threatened by all the chemical treatments that we have actually applied to our crops. And so we have a crisis. And so we do need to produce, as architects, not only homes for humans, we also have to produce homes for non-humans. And so to rethink that all the facades are not anymore just the spaces for ornamentation, for stories, for symbols to be told, but in fact for new inhabitants, no, to take place and to open up the kind of biodiversity and the different kind of biomes that we build. So those are also conversations that we are having. And so how does one communicate to a society when you ask for a home? You should not only ask for a picture of a modern house that you have seen in a magazine. You want to ask for a house that in fact is having pollinators also inhabited, or actually you want to have materials that are also capable of cleaning the air, or you also want to ask for materials that have the capacity to include others that have actually need for shelter and so on and so forth. So how do we open up our ideas about what it means to build, from the scale of the kind of handle of a door to the planetary scale of what and how do we care about those issues? That is something that we do within the universities, within the research centers, within the architectural offices. But how do we transmit them to society? Not only through documentaries of like fantastic homes and great cities, but it is also through these small spaces where one can experiment, where one can test, where one can sit down and do a workshop and communicate about the kind of work that architects also do in trying to innovate and to produce new things that hopefully might make life better.